And now we're thrilled to talk to Kao Kalia Yang. Kalia is the author of the memoirs The Late Homecomer, a Hmong family memoir, and The Song Poet, and the award-winning children's books, A Map into the World, The Shared Room, and The Most Beautiful Thing. She co-edited the groundbreaking collection, What God is Honored Here, Writings on Miscarriage and Infant Loss by and for Indigenous women and women of color. Yang's literary nonfiction work has been recognized by the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Chautauqua Prize, the Penn USA Literary Awards, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and has also won 3 Minnesota Book Awards. Weren't the most recent ceremony was last night, right?
It was, yes.
So this is possibly an updated number.
No, it's really 4. I have 4, but last night I did not win any.
Well, congratulations on being nominated and on all of this, these really important contributions to Minnesota literature, which is a lot of what we're going to talk to you about today. I'm also very lucky to be able to call you a colleague. And so thank you so much for making time to join us on the show. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be a part of this conversation.
You're a Hmong refugee, and in the prologue to your books, Somewhere in the Unknown World, you say that Minnesota is home to more refugees per capita than any other state in the nation, and it has the highest concentration of Hmong, Tibetan, Somali, Karen, Burmese, Eritrean, and Liberian refugees in America. You've been living in Minnesota for over 30 years, so I wondered if you could talk to us about the Hmong community and the refugee community generally in the state, and then maybe read to us from that book.
I would be very happy to read to you from the book. My family came here in 1987. We were part of the biggest wave of Hmong refugees to enter the country. When we came, we were resettled into the McDonough Housing Project, a housing project built for returning soldiers of World War II that had lasted, and of course, welcomed veterans from other wars, documented and undocumented. By the time my family came, mostly it was African American families, a few Native families, and then refugees in the housing projects. So I grew up from my very first years in America within a very rich refugee, this incredibly diverse refugee community. And that continues to be my life. I live on the east side of St. Paul, one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the city among refugees. So Karen refugees, Burmese refugees, Hmong refugees, Liberians, Eastern African refugees. We have incredible smells around dinner time. I can open up the window and pretty much, yes.
The book is composed of these people. I mean, there's a point in the book and later on, very toward the end, where you say, like, everyone who I'm writing about here are people that I know in my daily life, it seems like, in some way. I mean, so in a way, it's a portrait of the world that you're living in now, I guess. Is that correct to say?
That is absolutely correct to say. I didn't want to go looking for these stories. I knew that I was surrounded by them. So that is absolutely true. And this is from the prologue of Somewhere into the Unknown World. I was born a stateless Hmong girl in a Bon Vinai refugee camp in Thailand. For the first 6 years of my life, I understood that the camp was only our holding center. We lived in the 3rd sector in the 3rd subdivision in room 6, a small sleeping quarter I shared with my mother, father, and older sister. From the moment of my birth, the people who loved me told me that it was not my home. Home was once the tall mountains on the other side of the river. Home would one day be some foreign country on the other side of the ocean. I had not experienced war myself, but I was surrounded by its consequences. The adults around me told me stories of what had happened in Laos. On the hot days when the sun blazed in the blue sky, beneath the shade of thatch roofs, I traced the scars of the adults I loved. Ripples of rising skin, sunken flesh where bones should be. I knew their different cries in the dark of the night, the nightmares from which they fought to surface each morning. The tired, empty look in their eyes, and the fear in me that perhaps the people I loved were broken inside. On paper, I was a refugee. I looked the part. I was small for my age, thin and short, had big round eyes that peeked at the world from beneath of my bangs with curious, suspicious curiosity. I was a little creature kept in a little cage. I was a child keenly aware of the dangers of a world in which I belonged to no nation. When my family came to America and I was sent to school, I was placed in a class with many other refugee children, mostly Hmong like myself, but also Cambodian and Vietnamese. I was one of the youngest in a mixed age class. During art, some of the big students drew pictures of things they had seen before coming to America. A tall boy with watery eyes drew a picture of a thick green jungle and then a single foot sticking out onto a dirt path. The foot looked heavy and stiff and blue like a stone statue of a foot. The boy said that the foot belonged to his brother. He found his brother after an ambush. He hadn't had the courage to look into the heavy brush, to see if his brother's body was intact, to look at his face. The older children, who had seen more than we had wanted to let their stories out, for us younger ones to carry the weight of their memories together with them. We were willing because they were like our older brothers and sisters, our mothers and fathers, aunts and uncles, all those who lived through the wars. I've carried the stories of those around me all my life. I never thought that I would write them down, and I wouldn't have had my grandmother not died, illiterate and fearful, that the journey she had traveled in her life would be forgotten. So I told a story that much of America did not know about a people who were new to the written form, traveling across the country to speak about my book from state to state, city to city. I met many refugee resettlement workers and refugees. I discovered how little we knew of each other's lives and how the isolating loneliness many of us felt was a shared experience. Other refugees asked me to tell their stories, but I wasn't ready. I was a young writer then, looking for legitimacy in literary America, in a genre dominated by white authors. I was struggling to build confidence and stand up for the Hmong, and I could not fathom how I would carry the stories of other people. But even then, I was bearing witness to the heartache and the yearning of refugee men and women wanting to be understood. Over the past few years, I could not fail to see an America that was questioning its long history of refugee resettlement, an America that seeks to define itself by casting its most vulnerable immigrants and refugees to the margins of society. Greater than my fear of what I could not do was a growing need to convey the refugee lives around me, to show how our shared understanding of war and hunger for peace, our vulnerabilities and strengths, and to offer our powerful truths to a country I love. This book began in 2016 after Donald J. Trump was elected president. It didn't come out until November of 2020, until the most recent election of Joe Biden. And so in many ways, it is a book written in defiance of the highest powers of their land.
And certainly we're still feeling and I think we will be for a long time, feeling the after effects of Donald J. Trump. So we spoke earlier in this episode to Michael Clipper-Diggs about the ways that Minnesota's literary community has responded to the murder of George Floyd, the protests and uprising last summer, and the recent verdict of Derek Chauvin. And your memoir, The Late Homecomer, was published by Coffee House, and you've won Minnesota Book Awards. So I guess I'd like to ask you how welcoming the vibrant literary world of Minnesota, and specifically the Twin Cities, has been to writing by Minnesotans who are also refugees.
You know, I am part of a small wave, a small movement in terms of the emergence of the refugee writer in this landscape, in the Minnesota landscape, a state that, as you know, dominated by white folk. When I came out, I think nobody quite expected the book to do as well as it did. I remember having a conversation with Chris Fishbach, who was then the editor and then became the publisher and is no longer with the press, but it continues to be a friend of mine, about the book. And I said, what if it's huge? And he said to me, I don't think so, Kalia. We're not going to move that fast. You know, first we want it to be, and then we want it to survive, and we'll hope that it continues. The journey of The Late Homecomer has been in many ways a modest journey, a journey, very much a grassroots journey. First, it was the teachers who had taught students like me, who welcomed the books into their book clubs and then their classrooms. And every step of the way, it was individuals who were connected to the refugee story in some fundamental or professional perspective that guided it along. With that said, I've had an incredible journey as a Minnesotan author. I'm not what people think about when they think about Minnesota. You know, But when I emerge, I think people are kind of pleasantly surprised that a writer like me can thrive and survive here. And the truth is, Sugi, that the reality is that as unprepared as literary America was for me, as white Minnesota was for me, I was also unprepared. I had a lot of learning to do along that journey. And so in many ways, the halts and the stops have allowed me room and space to grow and develop in a much more deliberate way than instant fame and recognition and acceptance would have done for me.
Uh, when you talk about learning along the way of that journey, what are you talking about specifically? What kind of things do you think you learned during that journey?
So for the Hmong, the written language is new. It wasn't until the 1950s that a French missionary devised a written script to translate the Bible for the Hmong of Laos. Legends say that we had a written language many years ago in the lowlands of China. There was a cultural genocide and the language was outlawed. The women and the girls tried to hide it in our clothing. Hmong women, of course, are known internationally for embroidery, but there was a reason why. So we tried to hide the language generations, and now it is a language lost to flowers and symbols. So when I became a writer, I really didn't have, in terms of a model in how to do this, anyone around me. I come from an incredibly rich oral culture, an oral culture in which my Uncle Ang would tell me that the purpose of a story is like the stop sign on the road of life, that we must stop, check both sides, check the trajectory of the horizon before we continue, right? Entering into the form of the story, I knew that I would never meet an interpretation like that unless I put it, I had room to contribute. And so seeing even the spaces and places was something new along this journey as well. Everybody knows the spirit catches you and you fall down, and Fadiman's, work, seminal work. And for so many, that was their introduction to the Hmong culture. The way the Hmong family is portrayed in that book, right? As folk caught in the traditions of the past, as this perhaps primitive people here in America meeting this medical industry, that's what people expected. And so for the very first, 3 years of my life, I had to sit through many, many conversations where very well-meaning people are like, you speak English so well, or we're so impressed with your journey, as if it was a singular thing. I'm a communal thing. A writer emerges from a community, not just a family. But there was a lot of that for me to learn and to begin to stake my ground and to articulate who I am and what I'm doing in the landscape. So all along the way, from the form itself to my audience, as well as the pathway of a writer, these were things that I knew I was part of that journey in establishing for my people and many other refugee people who are also new to what is written.
So this commitment to refugees has a history in Minnesota. And Minnesota, is famed as a progressive liberal state. And, Walter Mondale, who recently died, that was the only state he won when he ran against Ronald Reagan. The state still votes Democratic, but in recent years, especially outside of the Twin Cities, it's starting to be more and more conservative. And I think that Trump campaigned hard there, and he's, really been thought of Ilhan Omar as a representative from Minnesota, as someone who can attack. So what is this change about, and how does it reflect attitudes toward refugees? I mean, is Minnesota willing to be liberal and welcoming only up to the point at which the overwhelming white majority begins to worry that it's not so overwhelming anymore?
I mean, that remains to be seen. We are in the trenches of that operation in so many ways. Minnesota first became like a first and then a second stopping point for refugees because of its incredible churches, Lutheran churches, the Catholic churches. All of the churches here were part of the original resettlement program. And then once these refugees are resettled here, they continue to sponsor other family members. And then because Minnesota is a headquarters state for so many corporations like 3M or Medtronic, there were a lot of low-skilled jobs in the factories. I mean, that is one reason why my mom and dad came here and had the fields of California where other Hmong refugees were headed, because they knew that they had 2 girls. They knew that the size of our hands and our feet were small. We would not be able to venture far on the fields. They hoped that perhaps within this framework, they could get jobs and we could get educated. And one day we could be able to build with our hearts and our minds. They understood well the limits of the human hands. And so That's how we ended up here. And that's how I think so many families continue and refugees continue to enter into the state. What is interesting is that places like Rochester or like Mankato, they're also becoming, what do I call it, focal points of refugee resettlement. So populations like Somali are popping up there, the Hmong, in Marshall, Minnesota, because of like poultry farms and those factories. And so slowly around these things, not just within the Twin Cities, but we're beginning to see models of the Twin Cities in other parts of the state. And I think that's alarming for a lot of folk. I don't think that it's a coincidence that Dante Wright was murdered in Brooklyn Center. Brooklyn Center, if you look at the history of the suburb in the last 25 years, more than any American suburb, its demographics have shifted. It was white, and now the predominant population is no longer white. And so I was personally not surprised by what happened there, because I interviewed and I thought extensively about writing about Brooklyn Center in Somewhere in the Unknown World. And of course, it never made it into the manuscript. But I think that is a part of these cities that we have to reckon with. Minnesota is a city or a state full of paradoxes. We have the Phillips neighborhood, the most linguistically, diverse neighborhood in the whole country here. We have more Korean adoptees in the state than any other. Just beyond the refugees, we have all of these interesting things happening. We have more international Chinese students here at the University of Minnesota than any other institution across the land. I mean, there are a lot of influences, a lot of thoughts and ideas, and a lot of realities converging here.
This
I
has
think
made,
if you,
Go
yep.
ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to
No, I
interrupt.
think if you want to deliver a new Minnesota, there's going to be a delivery process. And I think that is perhaps what we're seeing. Optimistically, I hope that's what we're seeing.
This may be out of left field. I don't know if this is true at all. This is just a thing that I thought up while I was thinking about this episode. Like, is it possible, and you talk about the churches and their commitment, particularly the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church, to refugee resettlement in Minnesota, but I wonder if, because Minnesota was home to many people who came from Norway, right, or sort of the northern European countries, who also were sort of excluded in the United States when they first got here, if there is some of that historical memory of what it's like, and that it's difficult to be a refugee, and that some of that is part of at the beginning of this, do you think that makes any sense?
I think so. And I think, of course, it makes sense. And we have to remember that in terms of the states, Minnesota is relatively young. It's like 260 years old. Unless you are Native American, we all came from somewhere to call this place home. It wasn't that many generations ago that our English was laced with the accents of a bigger world. And so these memories are not old by any means when I think about 250 years. And I think all of that is true. So totally, Whitney.
I do think that there's also, and I'd be curious, Kalia, to know what you think about this, but just my impression of sort of Scandinavian cultures here, right? There is kind of this stereotype of insularity, but there is also a culture of sort of non-performative aid, like a community, like it is assumed that the community will do good. And I think that's connected to the religious organizations that you're talking about, right? That and so here, I remember arriving here where weirdly Walter Mondale was like the second Minnesotan I met. I went to lunch somewhere to meet a faculty member, and she was talking to Walter Mondale. And then we sat down for lunch, and she was like, the Center for Victims of Torture is here. Human Rights Advocates is here. And there are all of these organizations, some of which, at least one of which I think was originally affiliated with the university. And so there's this culture and sort of stereotype of like Minnesotans, white Minnesotans here is what I mean, will keep to themselves. And then there are also these organizations that are very much outward looking and engaged in aid for refugees and immigrants, and very involved in social good and in sort of again, like a non-performative way that I associate perhaps stereotyping, I don't know, like, but with sort of a kind of generosity that isn't looking for cookies, not to put too blunt words to it, but that is something that I admire, even as I find it hard to reconcile with certain other kinds of quiet that I sometimes find here.
That is, I think, absolutely true. When I first emerged as a writer, more churches invited me to speak in than bookstores. And I remember I go to these churches, and of course, I come from a shamanistic tradition. I'm the granddaughter of three Hmong shamans. And now I happen to have married a white guy whose mom and dad are both ordained ministers. But I would go to these churches, and there was always this understanding that yes, Jesus was a refugee, you know, and we all need to be reminded of these facts. Some of the first stores that I shopped in were church basement stores, you know, and I remember traveling with my mom and my aunt across the cities before the school year. Every year, there would be these white Minnesotans, and sometimes the shirts were like $2 or $3, but they would look at us and they could see that we were perhaps wearing rags, and they would say, "Oh, maybe you can take it for $1." You know, and I think it is that way. It wasn't like, "I'm gonna give it to you for free," but instead of two, if you give me $1, it's yours. You know, and I always felt like that wasn't simply because of pity alone. There was goodwill involved in those gestures across those many years. And I want to recognize that as well. I think it's important to this conversation about how it is that we've all come to be together.
It's a really unusual place, and you talk about a process, and I think that's a really interesting point you made before about the ways in which immigrant and refugee populations along the lines of what we've seen in the Twin Cities are also popping up in places like Rochester, and also outside of the Twin Cities, right? There's larger white populations in some cases, places where there's a lot of kind of white anxiety. Um, there's conversations about what place white supremacy has in some of those places. I remember there was a New York Times article about St. Cloud that I found like totally horrifying. There was another piece about, white supremacist organizations trying to find footholds in some of these places. And so it seems like not only a process, but also real friction. And of course, I think, to see the ways in which that has impacted refugee communities has been really hard and painful. And earlier, I'm curious to talk to you about our first guest, Michael Claber-Diggs, has written about the difficulties of being Black in Minnesota. And you include in Somewhere in the Unknown World some really helpful statistics about Minnesota's status as one of the worst places for racial inequality, and specifically for Black residents. What are the connections and communications like between the Black community in a place like the Twin Cities, and then also the various refugee communities we've been discussing?
We have to talk about intersectionality, that word, because so many, when I talk to refugee resettlement workers, they say that the hardest thing they have to say to a refugee family is that we are resettling you into poverty. We all know the statistics about Black folk in these cities in terms of poverty. And so we were in the same neighborhoods. We grew up in the same neighborhoods. My first fights for and against were with African American, Black and brown kids. We were each other's neighbors. We robbed each other. I didn't rob anybody. We were robbed by our neighbors, like they took our TV, but when we didn't have, when we had to call mom and dad after school because we didn't have the keys into the house, it was also our neighbors who opened the doors for us to see our TV and call using their phone, call mom and dad to pick us up, building grounds and battling grounds. And so in many ways, for me personally, and because I grew up in the poor parts of the cities with predominantly people of color and Native folk as my first friends and my first neighbors, I've always known what team I was playing onto in a very real way. You know, we did our clothes, we cleaned our clothes at the same laundromat on the corner in the same machines. There are these truths that govern my lives that it seems it's taking the majority culture much longer to recognize, but I've always known what team I was playing on. White folk were the folk who educated me in school. They were the people who stood in front of the classrooms, the social workers who called and sometimes visited our parts of our side of town where all the kids would run home because, we could see a cop car coming. And so from my own experience, that remains true. White folk were the folk that I didn't quite understand. I didn't know how they lived. I understood the language, I understood the books that we were reading together, but I couldn't quite understand because those were people on the other sides of town. My mentors, even when I went to college, were African American. And the same continues to be true. Some of my closest friends, because that's the way I grew up, in these neighborhoods where we were also poor together, where we had so much to hide from and so much so little to fight about at the same time, so much to contend with. So growing up, mom and dad were always working. It was us and our neighborhood friends, and their parents were also always working. So we ran across each other's yards, which is an interesting, I think, perhaps antithetical to what so many people talk about when they talk about Asian Americans and Black folk. Certainly not and refugees, very few refugees, if any, fit into the crazy rich Asian category. The refugees I know tend to be poor. We tend to come from the same sides of the cities. But our stories are not the stories that are out there. Our stories are not the ones that the media gravitates toward.
And as you're talking about this, I think, of course, of Dalal Id, who is a Somali American man who was shot by Minneapolis police at the end of December. He was the first person shot by Minneapolis police after the murder of George Floyd. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that case and its impact, how it was felt in Minnesota's refugee communities, because I mean, it was really, I mean, at least in my opinion, heinously handled. It was very painful to read about and to feel that it was had, of course, yeah, it was impacting people who were already so vulnerable.
Far too familiar. I grew up with Jason Yang, who's a Hmong kid, a very sweet kid. We started third grade together. We graduated together. Jason Yang was, the police said that he jumped off a bridge about 8 or 9 years ago, and nothing was ever done. Nothing has been done in the Id case. Fong Lee, another Hmong boy shot by police. They said that he was carrying a gun. The video footages, would indicate that his hands were empty. So in many ways, the Id case is far too familiar. And in many cases, the media, the light only shines in certain directions. And certainly it doesn't shine toward the Somali community or the Hmong community or any of the refugee communities here. We don't have the manpower and the volume to demand the kind of attention. In many ways, and this is tricky, right? Black Lives Matter is fighting for all of us then. And I understand that. I wouldn't presume to speak for anyone else, but I've always understood that it was the same fight. It wasn't because I was an ally. It was because we were in the struggle, just part of the invisibility cloak in some sense. So that case makes me incredibly sad. I wish that there was more of a platform for the Somali refugee communities to speak forth about what happened there, what needs to happen there.
Given the timing of our episode, which is coming right after the verdict in the Chauvin case, I wonder if you could talk about the possibility that there's a real connection between growing anti-immigrant and anti-refugee sentiment in Minnesota, which we touched on earlier in this conversation, and increasing violence by police in the state toward people of color, whether they're refugees or not.
I mean, certainly true. I mean, anti-Asian hate or anti-Asian is something that's it's all over the news, and it happens here. I grew up going to a pretty white place called Connie's Creamy Cone. We lived for a time near the Como Park, and my grandma, who would come during the summer, cones then were 59 cents a pop. And grandma would counter her change, and we'd walk like the 3 blocks to Connie's Creamy Cone to buy treats. It's one of my most sacred and beloved Minnesota memories. When this pandemic first started and the rhetoric against Asians, began, a Hmong man was beaten at Connie's Creamy Cones. Like, the site of this childhood bliss had been destroyed completely. He was punched and battered, and I saw his photo all over social media among the Hmong community. That is, I was devastated. It took me months before I decided that I was going to take my children there this summer, that they were ready, and that we were ready, and we're going to go back there and reclaim Connie's Creamy Cone so that the memory of my grandmother could live on, so that my kids could experience a connection to that story and that woman who is no longer a part of my life or theirs, except in memory. Whitney, your question is in many ways the same question that I get asked all the time when we talk about what happened to George Floyd. Tu Tao, a Hmong officer, was also at the scene of the crime. In fact, when the first images of what happened to George happened, it was of Tu Tao, not Derek Chauvin, that was shown across the media. And I remember talking to a very well-known East Asian writer who wanted to write about the Hmong experience for the New York Times on the phone. And it was so clear to me that she wanted me to talk about this divisiveness within the structure. And I kept on trying to explain that if you have so many Hmong people, when we talk about Asians in these cities, it's predominantly Hmong. And when we talk about, all of us working together, living together. In terms of the numbers, there were always going to be Hmong cops. It is the structure of the police that is more deadly than all of these other minor structures. And in the end, I don't think I could give her anything she wanted, anything substantive. You know, can I connect her with Chauvin's wife, who is also Hmong? I couldn't, and I wouldn't. I don't want to. I saw all the newspapers where they blasted her page, her face as Miss Minnesota, and where I read the comments what white men and Black men wanted to do to her body. Of course, I would never share her contact information. That was out of the question. And this writer was coming from a good place. They wanted to write to include the Hmong perspective, but it was clear to me that they couldn't do it because they didn't understand the particulars of our place here as poor refugees and poor people of color. That's very hard, I think, for the rest of the country to understand. And yet within these cities, it is true. We have to claim and reclaim and restake these memories so that this place can be a good place, even when all is said and done.
As you're talking, I'm remembering that, another cop here who was convicted was Somali in the shooting of a white woman. And yeah, I think people's ability to understand structures is just really, I mean, from a storytelling perspective, it's a challenge to help people see that it is a systemic issue, that it is the structure and history of the police. And this seems to me like one of the things that your book's form kind of takes on, that structure, by accumulating these individual stories in this way. You're also helping us to build an understanding of the structures of how refugees live and are treated, even through the intimate details of those lives. In this book, you collect the stories of different individual refugees. And in The Late Homecomer, that starts with you writing in third person about yourself. And here you bring yourself really intimately close to others' perspectives, writing their stories in first person, which is a form I would think of closer to an as told to almost. And you write a little bit about the book's form, about promising yourself you'd include the story of everyone you spoke to, not wanting to select out or in. And of reaching a point, as you were talking about this earlier, of being ready to tell other people's stories. Can you talk a little bit about what the form of collective memoir means to you and why that collectivity is important?
For me, in the very beginnings, I started my work in the memoir by perhaps flipping its narrative, right? Memoir in this country has been traditionally a realm of the rich and the famous. We want to read memoirs about people whose lives are already recognized as interesting. That very first book, The Late Homecomer, right in the title, a family memoir. So already I was making it communal, and that work continues to grow. In many ways, culminates in this collective refugee memoir, this collective. In many ways, it is a cry. In other ways, it is a song. And into my ears anyway, of the refugee. I've come to understand that as individual as our lives are, they're not particularly unique. The human experience isn't. We live, and if we're lucky, then we get to live quite a while before we die. And all we have to give to the world at the very end, if we don't have like legacies, like buildings named after us and statues and stuff like that, right, are the strength and the wisdom of our stories. This is our offering, our words and our tears. And I wanted to commemorate that in a real way, because so many of the people in my life have given me their stories so generously in the hopes that I would keep them. But I'm 40 years old now. I know that dementia is a real threat, a real danger, among other things. That memory itself is faulty. And I've come to trust in this form, Sugi, that if I write it down, then maybe I will remember, that maybe the world will remember with me. Each and every single person who agreed to share their stories with me for somewhere understood that to be true, that I wouldn't be in the end offering them a mirror so they could see themselves reflected, that I was offering a portraiture. We all come from places and countries in the world where we understand mirrors break. When you go to the great museums, it is the portraits that stand sometimes. So these individuals wanted to give me an opportunity with this book to put our stories right there. And that's honorable. I come from a grandma who's one of them, the one who I knew, a great shaman, a medicine woman, and a healer. And she always said to me, do you know that every time you have the power to help somebody, you have the ability to hurt them? You must remember this, you know? And so I let that sentiment guide me in the writing, understanding the incredible power that I had as a writer in carrying these stories. After the book came out, before it came out to the general public, I made sure that every single person got a copy of the thing. The text messages and the phone calls started coming, and my heart was beating in my chest the whole day, you know, because I didn't know what they would say. Say Muda Wong Sai, who's Lao American, she's an incredible playwright in her own right and an author. She could write her stories in different ways, because often people want to say you're giving voice to people who don't have a voice, and I'm refusing that in this book. You know, I am refusing that. I'm saying sometimes we put our voices together so we can be heard. But Mooks, when she read her piece on Burial and a Birth, she said, I couldn't have written it the way you did. And that was the gift of this whole experience. And so this book is near and dear to me. A collective memoir is exactly what it is. It is a collective memoir of the refugee experience. And now that the book has been in the world for like 5 months, I'm beginning to get emails from further out, you know, beyond the bounds of the state. And it is amazing how many of them say that, you know, my story is just like that person's story or that person's story. Because we all know that when you write, it is the pulse of humanity that you try to feel. People will put boxes, they'll say, Kalia is a Hmong writer, Kalia is a refugee writer, but I am writing of the human experience from where I'm positioned.
I'm really glad you mentioned Mooks, who I also know. And for those of our listeners who are not familiar with her work, you can look up Refugenius. And I thought it was really interesting that, because she is a writer and an artist in her own right, that her story was in here. And I thought that was like a kind of beautiful exchange. And I think also such a powerful response to that question, right? I really detest that phrase, like a voice for the voiceless. I don't know, war without witness. Well, the people who were in the war were there. So it seems like such a really, like, to structure it in this way seems like a really meaningful response to people who would flatten those stories in that way.
Exactly, and I think that speaks to the first person, my response, right? I actually have a voice. Who's listening? And from where are they listening?
Near the end of the book, there's a brief but pretty important section about the logistics of refugee resettlement. I thought we would close by asking you to read a section from that and talk to us about why you included it.
I'd be delighted. It's a very pragmatic insertion. More often than not, when people hear about my work, they want to know how refugees come to America. And I can spend like 15 minutes of a talk addressing that, or just have it in the back of this book. You know, and I think that speaks to the reality of being a writer like me, writing the kinds of books that I write from. Sometimes it's a simple Google search at the end of the day. But it is a question that, you know, instead of talking about form or structure or content, that folk would want to know. And so I wanted to respond to that in a thoughtful manner. So I included, you know, there's a section about perspectives from refugee resettlement agencies, but in just a very brief note, there is, you know, the process of refugee resettlement. Like a page. Logistics of refugee resettlement. A refugee is a person outside of his or her own nationality, unwilling or unable to return to their home country because of a well-founded fear of persecution based on their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. It is a legal status granted by state governments or the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, after careful screening and vetting. Every October, the President of the United States, in consultation with Congress, sets a cap for the number of refugees we can take in as a country. The State Department is mandated with overseeing refugee resettlement. It works with 9 national voluntary organizations that divvy up the humanitarian support for refugees with more than 200 nonprofit organizations across the nation. Each refugee is expected to take out a no-interest loan for his or her own flight, with the first installment of the loan to be paid 6 months after the date of arrival. When a refugee arrives, each receives a one-time grant of $1,125 from the federal government to be issued by a refugee resettlement agency as it sees fit, generally $50 upon arrival, then $200 to $600 for food and other basic needs. And then the rest is held in reserve for housing. Each resettlement agency gets $950 to help each refugee resettle. A refugee has the assistance of a refugee resettlement agency for some 90 days to set up the foundations of a life. Secure housing, find jobs, address medical needs, navigate school enrollment, sign up for English language courses, participate in cultural and safety orientation, and connect with community resources. Once the period is over, the refugee is expected to survive on his or her own. It's a pretty simple and straight up thing. It's important to note that the refugee comes to America already in debt to the government. That is a fact that very few people know about. And then the fact that the resettlement period in this country is 90 days. In Canada, it's a year. Much more logical. In Canada, it's much more logical. But it's also important to know that right up until 2017, the number of refugees that we accept as a country exceeded all of the world's countries combined. So we were a major force in terms of refugee resettlement. After 2017, things changed fundamentally. And I know that President Joe Biden has just agreed to raise that cap to 125,000. But I just met with refugee resettlement folk this week, actually earlier in the week, and they were telling me that the last time we were able to actually do that was 30 years ago. So it was, or it was 1990, excuse me. So it's going to be a long time before we can actually accept the number of refugees that we are willing to. Because when President Donald J. Trump came into office, a lot of those, the thread, the process, it was nipped in many different points. So it would take that much longer for us to retie those strings and facilitate the process. And these are all important to know about refugee resettlement. It will be quite a while before we can actually receive refugees at the numbers that we were.
Kalia, thank you so much for laying all of this out so clearly and beautifully for us and for sharing these stories with us. We really appreciate your taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much for having me, both of you. Thank you for such a substantial conversation.
Thank you very much. And we will encourage our listeners to go out and pick up Somewhere in the Unknown World, a collective refugee memoir.